Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Rabbi Ron is like a mentor, so I feel as though I'm kind of on trial. You know, when you're studying to be an imam, you have to speak in front of your teachers. So I have kind of that same feeling tonight. I'm worried if I make a mistake, I'll be called upstairs later on. So hopefully,
Yeah, bring it up a little.
this is the first mistake.
No, it's not a mistake.
I'm just
Our mic.
Rabbi Ron, Rabbi Matt, Burns, so many of the incredible leadership we have in this community are dear friends, brothers, and teachers. You know, I told my wife, this is my rabbi. You have to get sanctioned by him for our marriage. That's how I look at him. He's a mentor and he's a friend and he's a brave person. What else would be able to draw all of these hearts together, all of these minds who come from different ethnicities, religious backgrounds, languages, food, except someone as transcendent as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It is said that great icons build fan clubs, but greater icons build hearts and build spiritual capacity. Even though he has passed away and he's no longer with us, all of us tonight, whether young or old, are touched by the powerful spirit that was left when he passed away. One of my teachers who I sat with in Egypt, we had a discussion once, and MLK Jr. came up in the discussion. And someone actually referred to him as a prophet. Of course, in the most orthodox, books on theology, that might get you in trouble. And our teacher said, although he wasn't a prophet in the theological realm, what he is a reflection of a prophetic universal. And that's the prophetic universal of justice and commitment to seeing oppression eradicated. 3 areas that I want to touch on quickly, and then we'll move on, of course, to some more incredible singing and praise and prayer and fellowship. Number 1 is the importance of leadership. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was under no delusion about the need for people who would be willing to take a punch to the jaw time and time again if it meant pushing what they believed earnestly to be the truth. And one of them was touched on by Rabbi Ron, this mandate of universal brotherhood, the prophetic tradition which he quoted perfectly, that the Prophet said, "La yu'minu ahadukum." Prophet Muhammad said, none of you are going to perfect your faith hatta yuhibba li akhihi ma yuhibbu li nafsi, until you love for your brother or sister what you love for yourself. One of our great 6th century theologians, Imam An-Nawawi, he said, here that brotherhood does not simply mean the brotherhood that exists in the 4 corners of a mosque, but this brotherhood is that exists in the 4 corners of the world. You can never claim to be a true Muslim unless you love those who are outside of your community as you love yourself and those who pray with you. And this is a very powerful mandate. But what Martin Luther King Jr. understood very well is that it's not simply a slogan, brotherhood, sisterhood, but it's something that required commitment and would face adversity. On a commitment level, in 1964, June 12th, 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. sent a letter to congregations across America saying basically, I need help, I need support. And 30 rabbis rose and stood with him. Brotherhood requires commitment, requires perhaps at times spending a night in a jail or 2 for something that you believe. And we all know that Joseph was the best prisoner that ever spent time in prison. Number 2 is that brotherhood will face adversity and sisterhood. And one of the greatest adversaries to true fraternity is insecurities and the unknown. Ahmed Shawqi, who was a brilliant Egyptian poet, and he has this incredible poem. I learned it in high school in Egypt. I went to high school again in Egypt when I was 30 years old. And in that poem, he says that there's an ant in what's called the Muqattam, which are small hills in Cairo, who finds itself climbing this hill. And suddenly this ant realizes, I'm an ant. Ants don't climb mountains. And this ant begins to listen to its conscience. And it says, Watara Tawdam, it saw these huge hills in Fasa, and that its legs just fell flat. And it said, Qadat Hallaka Yomi, my day is over, my life is destroyed, because I'm an ant and I'm climbing a mountain. I have no business climbing a mountain because I'm an ant. So what does this ant do in the face of the unknown, in face of those things that have not been defined? It flees. And Shawqi, he says at the end of this incredible poem, سَقَطَتْ فِي شِبْرِ مَاءٍ هُوَ عِنْدَ النَّمْلِ كَالْيَمْ, that this poor ant fell into a puddle. And a puddle is an ocean to an ant. And it drowned. And at the end, the ant, as it's drowning, says, I should have never listened to my insecurities. I should have tried to engage the unknown. I should have mustered the courage to build reality. But instead, I listened to these unknown fears. And the bottom of the poem says, صَاحٍ لَا تَخْشَى عَظِيمًا فَالَّذِي فِي الْغَيْبِ أَعْظَمُ. Indeed, you're right. Never fear great things, because what you flee to may be more dangerous for you. As our communities have grown over the last, year, 2 years, the ISBCC was built by the Jewish and Catholic and Presbyterian communities, just it was built by the Muslim communities. We're going to face insecurities, people within all of our traditions who are not necessarily happy with us getting to know each other and with the process of humanizing each other and our experiences in building what I'll talk about next, the capacity to forgive. MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., constantly talked about the need to build capacity to forgive people. He considered forgiveness a weapon, a power that few people truly were able to harness, but when they were able to, they could change the world. I had a teacher once, as anyone who's been in a seminary knows, it's a very competitive environment. Don't think that it's a bunch of people singing Sufi love poetry and drinking green tea. It's not really how it goes down. Right? There's a lot of competition in those Eastern seminaries. And I remember I was complaining to him about someone we were competing in memorizing. There was this 1,000-line poem in Arabic grammar. What a wonderful thing to memorize. And I remember this individual was very competitive. So I complained to one of my teachers and I said, I just can't handle it anymore. I'm going to lose it. And he said to me, if you're able to harness forgiveness, you can turn metal into bubblegum. But you have to harness it. And it's very powerful in the Quran. The verbs used for forgiveness are verbs that bring about the feeling of tafa'ul, which is that a person has to enact it in themselves. They have to find the capacity. Communities must acknowledge the fact that we've all made mistakes. But with forgiveness, we will not allow those mistakes to shape our future, but we'll let our future change the mistakes of the past. And that's a commitment. And I learned this by doing, number one, humanizing, and number two, admitting my own mistakes, seeking my own forgiveness of my mistakes and those around me. When I finished my studies in 2010 in Egypt, I received a phone call from a rabbi from New Jersey. And he said to me, you need to meet me in Poland. So you can't say no to your rabbi. So I said, okay, I'll see you in a week in Poland. There in Poland, we met at this small restaurant. It wasn't the priest and the rabbi, it was the imam and the rabbi in a restaurant. We sat together, and I had been living in seminary land, which means I had no idea. I thought Usher was a guy who works in the theater, for you young people. I had no idea what was going on, and 50 cents was change. And he said to me, have you heard what's going on in New York? I said, I have no idea. And he grabbed me. This is a rabbi. He said, what type of the imam are you? And I said, no, I just graduated. I'm a new imam. You don't get smart with your rabbi. And he said to me, you need to take these things very seriously. This is why I brought you to Poland. I want you to see the power of collective hate. And over the next 3 days, and I don't like to talk about it as I've talked to Rabbi Ron, it's a very moving experience. You know, I went to Breckenau. I carried Hannah Rosenthal through Breckenau as she cried and said, this is where my grandparents were murdered. And it was there for the first time in my life that I witnessed the absolute horror of understanding that human hatred, if left unchecked, can do some of the most abysmal things that anyone could ever imagine. And what made it more interesting is a few weeks before I went to Poland, I had a Bosnian classmate in Azhar in Egypt who shared with me the story of losing his grandparents, his mother, his father, and his siblings. And he found himself absolutely alone in the world. And he said something that I heard from a survivor in Poland, and that was, I don't blame the people who did this to me as much as I blame those who failed to speak to this evil, to confront this evil. And that's the third point, collective work. The passage from Exodus, my grandmother was a member of the Church of Christ. If I forgot the story of Jethro till now, I'd be in big trouble. And that story is very powerful because it teaches us that we as Muslims believe that Prophet Moses is Ulul Azm, one of the most powerful, strong prophets of God, those of strong will. And even though he has all that strength and all that intelligence and that bravery, he's reminded of the importance of collective work. That forgiveness and brotherhood and speaking to evil and oppression and eradicating injustice cannot happen as a solo artist, no matter how talented you are. And that's why in the Quran it's very powerful. The supplications that we have in the Quran, we believe, that supplication is one of the most selfish acts of worship. We're encouraged when we supplicate to throw our hearts into it. Some scholars would say, young people, I don't know if you heard this one yet, if you can't cry, at least act like you're crying. Right? Get into it. Get into the zone. But what's powerful, in all of those supplications in the Quran, you find a plural. We worship you. We ask you. We seek your forgiveness. We seek your guidance. Even though I'm praying by myself in the night with the lights off, I am asking on behalf of all of humanity, God to bless us. And that immediately reminds me of the importance of collective work. Someone told me tonight, this is going to be a historic speech. I said, thanks for lowering, my stress level. But if there's one thing I want to leave you with, is that we have to begin to take each other as brothers and sisters. And we have to learn to forgive each other. And we have to learn not to believe the things that we are told about each other before we sit and face each other and get to know each other and hug each other and love each other and cry together and share together. One day I was sitting with Rabbi Matt, and he said, this concept of, I think you called it tahara. I said, what'd you call it? And those Muslims in the audience are, huh? He said, yeah, tahara or tathir, I believe was the word. I said, tathir is from tahara, yutahiru tathira. And I mentioned this Arabic root. He said, we call it the same thing. I said, I would have never known this unless God had blessed us to sit and have this conversation. So the last point that I want to make, the city of Boston, historically, moving forward, we have an incredible opportunity to hold hands. I read Jonathan Sarna's book, and when I read it, I said, that's us like now. And I'll be honest with you, the Muslim community has a lot to learn from its Jewish and Christian brothers. We're still prepubescent in this thing historically. Whereas we look at you as though you're tenured, or at least maybe you're even collecting your pension. There's a lot to learn. That doesn't mean you're going to retire, by the way. But if we're able to harness a concept of collective goodwill, to speak to injustice, to speak to the, unfortunate gentrification of Roxbury, to speak to revenue distribution in our city, to speak to the plight of immigrants in this country, to speak to the plight of, unjust policies, whether they're religious, social, or ethnic, in God's voice, we will be able to hopefully change not only the city, but our own communities for the better, and receive the benevolence of God. And that's why the Prophet Muhammad has a very beautiful statement that I'll finish with. He said, Ar-Rahimun yarhamuhumullah. Those who exercise mercy. And it's interesting, it's a plural. He didn't say it in the singular, the merciful one. He said the merciful ones. God will exercise His mercy upon them. Collective work, forgiveness, this mandate of universal brotherhood and sisterhood is what we hold in our hands today. We ask God Almighty to help us as communities to unite in speaking in His voice and to speaking to the oppression and injustice we see around us. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening.